To set the context for today's lesson, we need to back away from the immediate story a bit and look at the cultural climate of the day. Jesus has been collecting quite a following, namely because his teaching was radically different from the other rabbis of the day, and it was accompanied by miracles that greatly benefited the recipients. While that made him pretty popular with the folks from Galilee, it didn't set well with the current ruling Jewish political parties. During his last trip to Jerusalem, Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead. John tells us that in the wake of that miracle, a special council of chief priests and Pharisees was gathered. And the question was asked, what do we do? For this man works many signs. If we let him alone like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and nation. So, Caiaphas, the high priest that year, suggests that it would be expedient for Jesus to be executed for the sake of the nation. In other words, he's suggesting that the Jews in power work together with the Romans to identify Jesus as a rebel and then kill him. They don't believe that Jesus is the Messiah because it doesn't fit with everything that they have learned in their training. They can't see past their religious training to recognize the obvious power of God at work in Jesus' life. So, it makes perfect sense that they would want him dead instead of supporting him and inviting a war with the Romans that they have no way of winning. According to John's Gospel, from that day on, they, the priests and the Pharisees, plotted to put Jesus to death. Knowing this, Jesus took an unusual route home. He didn't follow the standard route that connected Judea and Galilee. Instead, he headed up north to a town called Ephraim, and he and his disciples had a bit of a respite, a retreat, if you will. John goes on to say that from that point on, Jesus no longer walked and taught openly among the Jews in power. So now we're up to the place where our story takes place. Jesus has headed back up north to visit friends and supporters in Galilee one last time. He's beginning his final journey south to Jerusalem for the spring feast, Passover. He's traveling along the border between southern Galilee and northern Samaria when he encounters 10 guys who are lepers. 9 of them are Jews. 1 of them is a Samaritan. Now remember, Jews and Samaritans hated each other. But here, these 10 men seem to have lost their prejudices and become brothers in suffering. All the social barriers have been thrown aside, and they now live in the common unity of suffering as marginalized citizens of this no man's land, removed from the surrounding villages and living most typically in caves or colonies where no one else wanted to be. They stand at a distance, as was prescribed by the law, and they yell out to Jesus, "Have mercy on us!" You got to think that they know of Jesus' reputation by now. Why else would they yell, "Have mercy," instead of "unclean," as was mandated by the law? These guys have faith. I mean, real, unadulterated, desperate belief that Jesus could fix this death sentence with a single word. He'd been doing it for years. And now they were going to get their shot at life and hope. There's nothing remarkable about Jesus' response. He just said, "Go show yourself to the priest." See, the process of being declared clean by a priest took time. The priest had to make a record of all the lesions and measure them and record whether they were growing or shrinking over time. These guys fully expected to be healed, but over time. And then the text says something that is remarkable. It says that as they went, they were cleansed. Now one of them, when he saw that he was healed, returned to Jesus and fell on his face at Jesus' feet, giving praise to God with a loud voice. Jesus asked the obvious question, where are the other guys? We know the answer. They're Jewish. They're headed to the priest. They know that they're healed, but they're still headed to find a priest. Why? It's simple. They cannot re-enter society until a priest declares them to be clean. What they want is the blessing of social inclusion. They want their life back. The Samaritan, on the other hand, feels no compulsion to continue on to the Jewish priest. He was clean, and he knew it. Another ritual, more good obedience, none of that was going to make him one bit more healed than he already was. It also wasn't going to make him a bit more liked or accepted by his Jewish neighbors. now that they were entering back into their Galilean villages. No, this guy had one objective, one desire: to worship God through gratitude to Jesus. And that's exactly what he did. So how does that apply to us? Pretty simple, really. How many of us read the text of our Bibles and we see that we're forgiven, cleansed of our sin? And yet, we continue to measure our healing by some set of religious practices. How many of us are still trying to keep some set of rules in the hope that a more religious or a more pious person will recognize our healing and declare us worthy of inclusion into the upper society of God's people? So here's an idea. What if we were to read simple truths like 2 Corinthians 5:21 that says, God made him who knew no sin to be sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God in him, and then believe it completely? What if that faith in our healing were to drive us away from exterior religious requirements and the approval of man, and instead drive us back to the feet of Jesus in worship and gratitude? What if we really drank deeply from the truth that we're cleansed, we're healed, and then let that truth drive how we live the balance of this day and the balance of the rest of our lives? Maybe today is the day that we find someone who knew us in our days of suffering and show them what life looks like when we hear the voice of Jesus saying, go your way, your faith has made you well.